But in some ways, it's almost just like a gateway to what's possible with your mind. If you want to go to those deeper
I
dimensions of changing who you are.
Yeah, I'm glad you went out far out like that because I agree. I think it is a gateway. This concept that where your attention goes,
Yeah.
energy flows. I mean, it's really that simple. If you're elaborating on this deity and you're spending time in that space of elaboration, it's going to shape human behavior. If you're elaborating on negative information, which we are wired to do, and you keep elaborating on
Yeah.
that, and you give that time, space, energy, oxygen, that is going to shape your behavior.
Welcome back to the transmission, my friends. To say that we're not very fluent in the language and use of our own minds is an incredible understatement. And on top of that, we're so influenced by things out of our control, what we're born into, what happens to us, what to think, how to think. Many of the above, we don't have any choice in until much later in life. And of course, by then, those things have spread roots. Those things have created a kind of psychical ecosystem, thereby heavily influencing us and limiting us. So I'm always looking for ways to expand our agency, get some more fluency, change the by science backed by solid people. Which brings me to a new technique for doing just that. It's called functional image training. It comes out of a university in the UK, and a book called The Choice Point about said practice. It is co-written by psychologist Jonathan Rhodes, who helped develop the technique, and a therapist and fellow at the Harvard Institute of Coaching, Joanna Grover, who is our guest in this Mind Meld. Joanna has trained Olympians, executives, elite military forces to do exactly what we were talking about, break out of that psychological autopilot that we're in, to hopefully break records in their own respective fields. So this is exactly the kind of novelty I am looking for. In this one, we muse about the hidden power of the mind and how to unlock it, particularly through visualization and this functional image training technique. We also talk a lot about the importance of emotion in terms of changing your mind and why that's often a really overlooked feature of working with and changing the mind. Why goal setting, at least in the way that it's popularly done, is so problematic and often fails, and much more. All of the links for Joanna Grover and her book, The Choice Point, are in the description, as are all of the necessary portals for all things Third Eye Drops and binary digital quintessence into it via the algorithm. That like and subscribe button, I would greatly appreciate it. And did you know that we've got over 300 audio-only podcasts that will never be posted here to YouTube with a myriad of brilliant beings? Do subscribe wherever you listen, Apple Pods, Spotify, wherever. And I hope you'll consider initiating yourself into the Wonder Lodge at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops, which is not only the best way to support the show, but get involved and get rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more. Join our book club, join our monthly Wonder Gym hangs on Zoom, and more. And with that, my friends, let's meld minds with the wise, wonderful, lovely Joanna Grover. Joanna, it is lovely to have a really novel modality that you've become an expert in and a proselytizer of. And I'm really excited about it, and I'm also curious about a few elements of it. So really looking forward to seeing where this one goes.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here, Michael, and I have no idea where we're going. So I'm open to wherever you're taking us.
Isn't that the best feeling, having no idea where you're going? Like on some level it's scary, but on the other hand, that's really one of the most raw human emotions. That's like the isn't that I think it's like what the Greeks called that aporia, that feeling of not arriving at an answer, but arriving at like a new open-ended question, you
I
know?
think I'm going to learn a few things. I'm taking notes on these words we're using. Um, but yes, that's how we begin. We use a style of conversation where we never know where our clients are going to take us, but we're open to it. So
Yeah.
I'm super comfortable with this not knowing.
Perfect. Perfect. Well, that's I feel like that might be one of the most philosophically honest positions to be in. So that's a good sign. That's a good sign. But that said, you do know a lot of things. You are an expert in this thing I alluded to called functional image training or imagery training, and
Mhm.
there's visualization involved. It is aimed toward behavior change and lengthening what you call a choice point.
Mhm.
But how does it, but on the other hand, people have probably heard of visualization. How does FIT, functional imagery training, differ from regular visualization?
Yeah. So a few things. First and foremost, I'd say it's the research. It's 20 decades of research, which
Wow.
started in understanding human cravings and how cravings can derail a well-intentioned person. So it's grounded in science. And it's also not just visualization. Some people are poor visualizers, like myself. I'm not a great visualizer. It's the five that we usually are aware of and taught. Plus, we add emotion, telling ways to shape human behavior in the future.
Interesting. Interesting. Would you be willing to take us through maybe like an example exercise? And I don't know if this would require like a hypothetical goal or things texture that applies to a lot of different things.
Yeah, so these are really good questions. So first of all, I really like your curiosity. So thank you.
Yeah.
We'll begin with even before we get into like help them define their goal. But we initially give a primer, so to give them a sense of what imagery is, and it often starts just like you start your show with like a deep breath, or maybe even four deep breaths. So we can leave like the chatter of our minds and travel to another dimension, if you will.
I will. I will
Okay.
always travel to another dimension when asked. Oftentimes, when not asked, I will as well. Um,
Mm,
yeah, that's really interesting. I
back
mean,
in.
yeah. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, let's
Continue.
do it. As a friend of
Yeah.
mine says, don't tell me you're a comedian, tell me a joke. So we're
Right.
going to right
Right.
into it. Okay. So go ahead and take a nice deep breath like you did before. Nice. I'll go ahead and relax your shoulders, relax your third eye. And you can either keep your eyes closed somewhere, the beach that in your mind's eye is one that you associate with warm feelings. And you step onto the sand and you notice the temperature, the texture on your feet. You take a nice deep breath in, noticing the smell that's in the air. You notice the sound. If anyone is there with you, you notice them. And maybe there's a taste. You're walking closer to the water. You hear the water lapping now. And you're just in a run in. And you start running and you leap in and you realize it's 50 degrees. You can go ahead and open your eyes.
I like cold water swimming, so for me it was okay. But I like that. Yeah. I mean, that's that right there. There's so much going on. There's so much going on in terms of mood altering. There's so I think it says a lot. For instance, like who showed up. There's just so much going on there. But yeah,
So much going on that when we quiet the chatter um, in the future, we can really begin to notice, oh, my thoughts do have imagery associated with them. Most of the time, they're passing so quickly, but it's the ones that we elaborate on, which are the ones that are going to shape our behavior. So I'll
right.
give you an example of this. My mom is a big skeptic. She doesn't believe in much, unless she can see it. And breathing and some complications from COVID, and her blood pressure was spiking. And I said, "Do you want to maybe give it like try what I teach people?" And she's hooked up to all this machinery. And she said, "Okay." There's nothing else for her to do. We were waiting for the doctor. So just like we did, but I knew her place was in her garden,
Mm.
tending to it was extremely high. And then we did this exercise where she's in the garden and she can hear the sounds, the smell, the taste, and the emotion associated with it. And it was definitely under a minute, and her blood pressure dropped. And she suddenly felt a little bit more at ease. So if we can do that in a matter of seconds, and she realized that her blood pressure had dropped 15 points, she said, you have to teach this to everybody, like in
Yeah.
hospitals who are suffering. And I said, well, we're working on that. But that we see time and time again. In the moment, it works. But if you practice it as a daily habit, like habit stacking, so you're using imagery for how you're going to have that difficult conversation, how you're going to respond when you're tempted, in a way that keeps you in alignment to like who you are and what you want, rather than social contagion or stress or I've run out of willpower and now what?
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that strikes me always in these conversations when we're talking about the power of the mind and all of these different types of knowing that we have in our bodies somatically,
Mm.
psychologically, is just how much fluency we've either lost or the quality of our thoughts, our minds, as you've pointed out, there's like cascading. And I guess this is really what your expertise is getting people to lean into this fluency, this ability, and recognize it and use it. Because my follow-up question is always, we have it, and it seems like there's so much evidence pointing to the fact, statistics about mindfulness. You can show people statistics about like what I just said, like cold water swimming or ice baths or whatever. But getting people to do it is another thing. So how do you
Yeah.
get people to really do it? Because I mean, even myself, there's
Yeah. No, I
sometimes I
mean,
meditate every day, sometimes I don't for a week.
yeah, it's true. I have the same thing with meditation, but with imagery because it doesn't require as much of my time right now, like my meditation practice does here. Um, so what I think what's different, and this is from studies, right? This is from academic studies in functional imagery training. Once people get it, they continue to use it. 6 months. There are 2 reasons for that. I think because we begin with giving people a sense of agency over their own lives. We
Yeah.
begin with curiosity. It's a style of conversation that's also science-based. It's called motivational interviewing. Um, we as practitioners are never the expert in the room. The person in front of us or alongside of us, they're the expert in their life. So we're unearthing ambiguity, we're unearthing resistance, but we're rolling with it. It's not like you have to, you should, you must. It's never that. So
Yeah.
we unearth this sense of agency that's tied into a bigger sense of meaning and value. And then the way we teach it, it starts really small. Like, let's start with one thing you want to change. And then after a week or 2 weeks, when they experience that, now they're like, oh, wow, can we use it on this? Sure. But first it's the individual, really, that it's their goal and not their doctor's goal, not somebody else's goal, but their own goal. And then we start small, and once they see how it works, and I've been trained in a lot of things from hypnosis to
Hmm.
cognitive. I've never seen anything work as efficiently and as effectively and as long lasting as this.
Very interesting. Yeah, it seems like this could work in so many different contexts. Like you mentioned, you were a therapist for a long time, coach high level people, so you also probably use it as a sort of peak performance or goal setting um technique. But it seems like this could you could almost use this in any context imaginable, and it's really just about there's almost like a creative application here. I think you could even I could even see how you could use this for like a spiritual practice, like if
Yeah.
you were thinking about um trying to be, kinder, more altruistic, or like, you know try to like channel something. Even like you can really take your mind, I think, to some profoundly different places through these kinds of techniques. But one of the things I'm still a little bit unclear on, so you mentioned hypnosis. That's another interesting maybe way to compare and contrast, because that's another modality that obviously asks people to get into a calm state, a suggestible state, visualize something. How does this differ from from some?
The person is going into a hypnotic induction. So
Mm,
they're in an altered state. And I found it very powerful, but as the practitioner, I didn't like that my client was in this altered state and I had
mm,
control over. Client is always in the driver's seat.
interesting.
So it's a lot of the same. Hypnosis is very imagery based. Um, but in functional imagery training, the individual that our clients use it, how long they stay there, we're guiding them. So
Mm.
it's a much more client-centered, client-driven.
What has been shown in the research as far as the efficacy, and what kind of things is the research based around? Is it mostly habit change? Is it like symptom reduction?
Mhm.
What are they typically looking at?
So it started in craving, right? And
Mm,
and it started with the theory of elaborative intrusion, um, which was two researchers in Oxford who were looking at why would be hijacked, and they were hijacked by cravings, which were sensory based. The sound of ice clicking against a glass, the smell of a cookie. Like these are sensory based cravings, and then the brain hijacks higher thought. And before you know it, the person is drinking or eating that cookie. Um, so what they did is they thought, well, can we teach people to crave what they desire, because the brain cannot hold two opposing images at once.
mm,
So you can change the channel to what they want, to how it's going to feel they want to wear. How will it feel to come to the finish line of being a British commando? Whatever it is, they experience that so that they get to choose. Is it the short-term solution at that choice point? Or is it something that's really attached to, it's usually a harder decision, but it takes them down a road that at the end they're going to feel a sense of accomplishment.
yeah, it's interesting. It's like using the mind to steer emotion, and then that creates more of a feedback loop than the way we typically think about something like goal setting, because goal setting typically happens up here
Mhm.
intellectually and conceptually rather than emotionally and somatically. And I think that's one of the primary reasons why it doesn't work very well, is because like it just ideas alone don't really sway people's actions. And it's like I mean, you even see this in politics, right? It's like the politician that can somehow speak to people's emotions, even really base emotions a lot of the time. Like that's the candidate that's probably going to win, not the
Yeah,
one who has like the best policies.
advertisers use this
Yeah.
all the time. If they can tap into our emotions, suddenly we're buying something that maybe we can't afford. It's an emotionally driven decision. Emotion is the most powerful in shaping our future. And yes, when we say goal setting, or I have an adverse reaction to that, right? Me personally, I'm saying I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
want goal, but if someone really understands me and I understand me, and know what I want. Now I'm paying attention. And as Einstein said, logic will take you from A to B, but imagination will take you everywhere.
Mhm.
And there is a little bit of magic. I mean, there's a ton of science,
Yeah.
but as a practitioner, I see things all the time that science can't begin to measure
Right. Yeah, I
out.
mean, like, I'm sure you're familiar with like the hard problem of consciousness, this idea of like the explanatory gap between what we can measure in the brain and and that in and of itself is a gigantically compelling idea. But then like yours is almost your interest is almost taking this another step further, which is, why do we have this ability to not only have a subjective experience of something, like, let's use the example of like tasting vanilla or something, and why does tasting vanilla have this specific effect? We have the ability to like summon the qualia to it, bodies and memories and all of these kind of ethereal things that we have, but we don't really understand what they are. And that
Oh,
in and
yeah.
of itself is incredibly magical and strange.
It is magical and strange. One of the first to do that was, and this is in the book. My son was 12 at the time. We were at a performance with a horse puppet, war horse. It was at Lincoln Center, and
Mm,
initially you see the puppeteers. You're paying attention to them because you can see them. They're outside the puppet. They're inside the puppet. But about midway through the first act, something inanimate to life.
mhm,
So it came to life for all of us, including my son, who's terribly allergic to horses,
mm.
who started to have a terrible allergic reaction in the theater, despite the fact that what he's allergic to are
Wow.
horsehair.
Wow.
There was not a horsehair in the theater, but he believed, and in his belief, it triggered a histamine reaction.
Wow.
He couldn't catch his breath. His neck was getting red because he normally gets hives around his neck. It was terrifying and fascinating what we can do when we truly focus on something in our mind. It's way more powerful. It's such a powerful.
Not that there's a script, but going off of probably what you typically talk about, what
Sure.
what do experiences like that make you think about consciousness and the nature of mind in general? Is it just an open-ended wonder, or does it change the way you think about it?
Yeah, it changes the way you think about it. The more you practice, it's sort of like meditation. The more you realize everything is a projection.
Mm,
Everything. And things that used to really upset me, I when we measure people's emotion, and we measure people's imagery, and emotion is one of the senses that we measure. So my emotional, like, ability to tap into my emotions is very high, higher than my visualization. For example, me or something can make me really upset, or why did I do something? I'll ruminate on it. And now I realize, okay, I can go down that path, but why? Like, why? And
yeah,
and I can use it, like, you're talking about spirituality, and can you use it with spirituality? I'm really having fun now using gratitude. So when
yeah.
something comes up that I'm like, oh my God, we missed an opportunity as a company, or as I always go back to gratitude. And my imagery of gratitude is that it builds resilience using this. No matter what system you're putting someone back into, you can put them in it builds this incredible resistance where
Mm.
people persevere through great hardship.
Yeah, I love that. I love that. And loving kindness meditation is a huge part of my personal practice too. That's one of my favorite ways to shift my mindset and even just get out of like the mundane sort of into being in on a daily basis of, I got to do this and I have to do that, and then, oh, I have to send this bill and whatever it is. Like, we lose sight of the fact that that is a very tiny bandwidth of what we're capable of existing in. But we're in a situation where we're coerced into being in that mindset on a daily basis. And something like loving kindness meditation is so powerful because it can snap you out of that way of being in a matter of minutes, and to like really change the channel on your consciousness in a profound way that not only changes the way that you're feeling, but it changes your actions. Like, I usually come out of those meditations like wanting to text my mom and wanting to like text my friends and be like, hey, I just thought about you, during my, and that's a meditation I was just doing. And that goes to show that we do have these highly plastics that, if we had a little bit of fluency in how to play with those, we
Mhm.
could all change our lives radically. But it's like getting people, like I was saying before, getting people to do it, getting people in contact with the right ideas, the right books, the right
Yeah.
goals, the conversation. But how do we make people want to prioritize that? That's something that I
That so
struggle
we
with.
use again, it's mental contrasting, right? Because the mind can hold two opposing images at once. So one of the most powerful things that we do, so after the primer, which we did a few minutes ago
Hmm.
with the beach, we would talk a little bit about a goal that you have in mind, right? And I would ask you questions that would sort of, I'm curious about it.
Hmm.
Well, and then it's typically what we see from people is they want to change a certain behavior, but we let them stay there for a few seconds using what emotion do you experience as you get out of bed in the morning? And then, oh my God, I feel so much lighter. I feel hopeful. And then we introduce a cue. The cue, athletes, cues are, and it could be anything. It could be rather elaborate, like certain tennis players, like shoulders relax. That could be your cue. But that cue triggers you to go into imagery, and you know you have a choice between that future where the change doesn't happen and the future where change does happen. You have that
Yeah.
choice.
Yeah.
And these daily cues, we habit stack them. Generally, people use mental rehearsal of how I'm going to handle it.
Yeah.
What will I do if something goes sideways? And it doesn't take that long, but because people have already experienced it, by the time they get to that situation,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Yes, absolutely. That's a whole separate. Have you heard of
um,
this?
I have heard of it. I haven't experienced it, if you wanna walk me through it.
Yeah, it's essentially what it sounds like, where you get into sort of a meditative state. You also, it's like a combination of visualizing and writing, but you really try to vividly imagine yourself X distance of time in the future, where
Mm,
you've accomplished your goals, how it feels, who you're with,
mhm.
etc. Passing it against imagine you didn't do it. And that, like, when you, if you really seems almost psychedelic, because in experiences I've personally had, if anybody out there has had a impactful plant medicine experience, there's usually a pretty potent mixture of light and dark. There's a pretty potent mixture of, like, being shown things you don't want to see, confronting trauma, confronting mortality, confronting, all these, like, self, or buried
Mm,
away in your shadow and you don't want to acknowledge that you've done those things. Well, guess what it's going to show you, and guess what it's going to bring out into the light of day. But then it also in heal whatever that thing is to the extent that you can. And I think to some extent what you're discussing almost mirrors that, designing your life and habits to sort of protect yourself from, but you're
funny, we've trained, like, 50 clinicians to use this, and we're gonna be training people around, "Can't we skip
yes.
a step?" And it's like, "No, this is really." Also, there's a lot that we also do, and this is part of the motivational interviewing is, well, what about beyond that goal? Like, who are you? Right? Because we see so many people who are so driven, there's, a whole narrative going on in their head. Who are you outside of this?
Mhm, mhm.
And I think that that's so important because we can be so focused. As, a coach once told me, "You can the
Right.
wrong thing. You've been
Yeah.
scaling the wrong thing." So we wanna know, and then job, and they're surfing now in Australia, and they've never been happier. Do you realize so and so like, these with my life right now. And we find people are really following through on it, which is
Yeah.
I pretty exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, it is really exciting. And it also, I think I tend to come at things through a pretty, like, mythopoetic,
Mm.
romantic, more philosophical, romantic way, or whatever. You eventually get to this point where you're confronting the purpose. I find that that often leads to a lot of impractical choices, in your work, you obviously work with a lot of really successful people who are CEOs or have
Mhm.
C in their title somewhere. Um, how often?
Label in the book, like,
Right.
you really get to the heart of the matter. It sometimes happens, but a lot of times what we'll see is that people will make more time for their personal life,
Mm-hmm.
right? If a company is hiring us, is the single pointed goal of achieving whatever it is, hitting within the team. And we've worked with some teams where when we get there, there's a high level of toxicity,
Yeah.
of just cruel. You have some ground rules, and then there's a sense of like, am I going to take a moment, take a deep breath, use my cue? I don't have a percentage for you of how many people leave, but there is a certain percent, but you can usually using these choice points in a meeting, and rather
Mm.
letting someone have it. They're using a cue. They're taking a little space between being triggered and response that they're talking to. It's a totally different, rather than both angry party. All I did was ask some questions. Like,
Right.
did that meeting go the way you wanted it to? And suddenly the reframing of something. So yeah, like I think it starts small, and then the more you use it, the more.
Truth be told, I knew I didn't want to do the job that I was doing for years before I made the choice, but it was
Mhm.
just, a combination of things stacking up in such a illness here. But
Mhm.
it seems like where it takes on a sort of, and
Yes.
that's one of those things that I think, like, it
Mhm.
might make you more aware of your behaviors. It might make you more aware of things that insert a new behavior or really change in the most times now is cueing. Could you give an example of, like, let's just use it because I know anxiety was one of your past sort of
Yeah.
expertises, something that pretty much everybody deals
Yeah.
with. They
Yeah.
find themselves getting anxious, can't stop this domino effect of anxiety or something. How would you use this technique, cueing, etc., to try to
Major achiever, has achieved incredible things. Um, and now is the first time in their 50s that they can like catch their breath. But that's scary. That brings up a whole lot of anxiety if you've
Mhm.
been going, going, going. It's a
Oh
like
yeah.
snowball effect. Oh my God. If I stop going, something terrible is gonna happen. So, we started with breath, which is again how you start your show. Homework was just to practice a certain breathing technique before each meal. And then her cue, she knows that she wants to devote this time to really figuring out what's next for her. So her cue became her breath. She would
Mm.
take a deep breath. And then eventually she had to normally go into, oh my God, like 5 alarm fire, she'd call it. She just would like find herself with her hand on her heart, taking a deep breath, going like, okay, what's the rational thing to do here? And it gave her more energy. It gave her a sense of like, wow, I can
So that cueing action is attached to a
train. I
yeah, go
mean,
ahead.
it's their mental image. It's their image of like, even if they're not clear, she wasn't necessarily clear on what she wanted. She knew she wanted to have.
Beginning, you're working on attaching an image to an emotion of calmness, and then through doing that cue, you can sort of summon the calmness that you've trained yourself already cognitively to.
But yeah, that's it precisely. The only thing I'd tweak in what you said, because what you said was, these senses, this imagery experience elicits emotion.
That makes
Smell,
sense.
like, yeah, your favorite meal, or it could be the adverse, like, that difficult conversation has happened. Maybe someone made a negative comment on something we did, or we got a voicemail or an email that really triggered us. Then we may need a slap,
Mm,
which is really stopping the negative thought looping, locating the cue, activating imagery to visit it later,
mm.
and you persevere.
I like persevere because it dispels this idea that you get rid of it. And that's one of those things that just always makes me cringe about a lot of visualization or thought change, especially in a more like new agey context. There's this idea where you're just like, oh, if you just change what you're thinking about and it's going to change your reality somehow. Like you're going to manifest this different reality just by changing your thoughts. And clearly there's such a giant missing piece there. Like I'm not saying thought has no downstream effects on what you're going to do and how your life is going to play out. Clearly, I think as we've been hopefully demonstrating throughout this conversation that that is a huge component, but the idea that it starts with just something as innocuous as a thought, I think there's just so much missing there. And I think the first big missing piece is steering emotion, what you're
Mm.
talking about, because emotion is really what determines the quality of your subjective experience, not the thought. Like I could think of the same food as you, and maybe you hate that food, maybe I love that food, just to use a like
Mhm.
random example. But yeah, I mean, even creative friends and myself, oftentimes if you're looking for inspiration or motivation or these sort of nebulous things that we all want but we don't know how to get them, thinking
Mhm.
about them is one of the worst ways to get there. Like thinking about it does not get you there. Like
Well, overthinking is such a hazard. I
yeah.
can analysis paralysis. I don't know about anybody else out there, but the
Oh
more
yeah.
I can think myself out and I can think myself in so deeply that like I'm losing perspective.
Yeah.
Um, so
If think
yeah,
Oh, sorry, I
think
was gonna make a dumb joke. I was gonna say if thinking worked, no one would ever argue about, like, couples would never argue about where they wanna go for dinner. You know, thinking about something, it just I think it innately almost creates anxiety and fear. Whereas if you start the process out by just confronting whatever you're feeling in your body and whatever, just investigating whatever's on your mind rather than trying to summon an answer out of somewhere. It's like it's almost like a cruel joke, in that if you're going after the answer is super elusive. But if you're not seeking the answer and you're just trying to be in the moment with how you're feeling with what you're dealing with, answers then seem to come to you or something.
yeah, no, I think that there's a lot to that. Again, there's a lot that we can't measure about
Yeah.
like the power of the mind, but there's definitely we are limited in our thinking if we just focus on the thinking. We can really fatigue our mind. Um, but if we allow ourselves to like again, like it's just quieting and going into your senses, going into that future. Who am I? What do I? How do I want to show up? And the really exciting thing is like you have this already. You use it all the time. But now we're going to teach you how to use it, how to measure it, how to train it, how to use it so that in these, let's say 60 choice points that you have a day, or these 6,000 thoughts you have a day, 60,000, you
Yeah.
get to choose rather than feeling like fatigue and oh my god, like I had this conversation the other day with some of the folks we've trained. We always have a monthly get together, and it was a conversation around willpower versus imagery. And the way I see it is willpower is like a tank of gas. Starts out full. Most people are better with willpower on Monday than they are on Friday,
Right.
and will justify, oh, I had a great week, I get to do whatever, or I've had such an exhausting week, I should get to do whatever. So willpower is like a tank of gas that runs low, whereas imagery is like a renewable source of energy.
Yeah. I like that. That's a powerful reframe. And I would have to imagine that you see the quality of people's personalities change through doing this. Because I'm glad you brought up however many thoughts we're supposed to have a day,
Yeah.
supposedly. Let me know where that comes from, by the way, because I've heard that
Yeah.
before, and I've also heard like we have this huge negativity bias that like most of our
Yeah.
thoughts are negative.
Yeah. So that's Leahy. And then the Human Genome Project is measuring the number of thoughts
Mm,
that you have in a day, which is anywhere from 6 to 60,000. It's interesting because it's less if you meditate.
mm,
And there's also more of like being able to achieve like sort of a bit of a flow
yeah,
state. So you're not, those thoughts can derail you or shake you, but if you're either a meditator or using your imagery, you're able to like, kind of like a cloud going by. I'm not going to latch on to that thought. I'm not going to latch on to that ending. It's not serving me here. But one of the things we found with mindfulness or meditation, like with athletes, like for example, Martina Navratilova, who wrote the foreword of the book, she said when she trained in meditation, it disrupted her tennis game.
Hmm.
She was not quick on her feet, and her coach was like, "You got to stop." You know, so things like the imagery and the way that we teach it, that you can use it in split seconds. You can use it, to just these cues will interrupt the neural pathway. It's like in the moment, in that choice. You can use it to mentally rehearse, but then you can use it in that moment. Do you let somebody in the grandstands who's made a comment or yelled something at you, do you let that disrupt your serve? Or do you use a cue? Do you get back into the game and back into your what you want it to end like?
Yeah. One of the things that I thought of when I started watching some of your other interviews and reading about this is, and I was started to think about this too, and I was saying that you could use this in a lot of different contexts, but I didn't want to go this out there that early on in the conversation.
Good. Go out
Is
there.
there's
I'm ready.
this esoteric Tibetan Buddhist practice where you I don't remember the exact name of it, but it's essentially like a deity meditation. And
Mhm.
the goal of the meditation is to almost merge your mind with the qualities of this deity. So like if you're like I think I read they'll often start with this deity called White Tara, and she's supposed to be this bodhisattva or goddess of, love, compassion, purification,
Mhm.
etc. So you're essentially trying to almost you visualize this deity so thoroughly and so regularly that your mind absorbs the qualities of this thing, and then therefore you become an agent of that archetype. You become compassionate, purifying, healing,
Mhm.
whatever. And this is what I meant when I was saying, like, depending on the context and how you think about these things, there's so many possible applications here. And because we live in the society we live in, of course we're going to think about it for career, goal setting, reducing anxiety, or
Mhm.
whatever. But in some ways it's almost just like a gateway drug to what's possible with your mind, if you want to go to those deeper
I
dimensions of changing who you are.
Yeah, I'm glad you went out far out like that because I agree. I totally agree with that. I think it is a gateway to this concept that where your attention goes,
Yeah.
energy flows. I mean, it's really that simple. If you're elaborating on this deity and you're spending time in that space of elaboration, it's going to shape human behavior. If you're elaborating on negative information, which we are wired to do, and you keep elaborating on
Yeah.
that, you give that time, space, energy, oxygen, that is going to shape your behavior.
Yeah. Yeah. And to the point earlier that we glanced up against, that we have all of these thoughts a day that I still don't
Mhm.
understand how they measure like what a thought is. Like that was one. No, that was two. Um but
That's
however,
why I read the book because I'm much more aligned with your thinking. But my co-author, Dr. Jonathan Rhodes, he would love to tell you how they measured that thought. And it's
okay.
interesting. It's not that interesting to me. I'm like, okay, yeah, but I would rather focus on, you know, the more spiritual, the more how do we alleviate human suffering, right? How do we help people? Because the world really is, we are at a choice point. We end the
Yeah.
book with like collectively, with global warming, with all these things coming at us. Um, how do we come together? How do we like step out of the autopilot? This, we don't even know where we're driving to, right?
Yeah.
A coach that I know was working with a group of executives at Google about a year ago, and he asked them, "How many of you want to live in the world that you're creating?"
Ooh.
And nobody raised their hand.
Whoa.
And then he said,
Whoa.
"What the hell are you doing here?" Right.
That's
So
a
this is, these are important conversations. This is an important time in history of like, how are you going to use these however many thoughts? How are you going to use these choice points? How are you going to get back the body in alignment with the mind? Another great thing that a friend taught me, she said, after reading your book and after just knowing you, she said that I think the biggest takeaway for me is that my mind in the beginning was not on my side.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Right. So if we
That's
can get the
profound.
mind in alignment with the body and the spirit, the soul, we can do incredible things collectively.
Yeah. That's a really profound realization and just thing to come to terms to with in general is that if we are having all of these thoughts, however many there are a day, and most of them are negative, then that really says a lot about I mean a lot of things. I mean, I think you could read into is this the way we're designed? Is this some kind of evolutionary hangover and we have to think this way to protect ourselves? Or is it a symptom of a very sick society where we are biased toward negativity because of the images that we're constantly inundated with, because of the things going into our bodies, because of the way we are either overtly or somehow underhandedly, subliminally trained to think about ourselves. Like all we can't answer all these questions, but what we can do is slowly change the quality of these thoughts, I think. And that's why I love disciplines like positive psychology and like what you're doing because they're giving actual evidence-based tools to change the
Mhm.
quality of your mind and how you think about the world because people talk about toxic positivity now, but from where I'm sitting, there's still a giant imbalance. Like we're allowed to orient toward the positive, toward the things that make us feel good, because there are all the myriad of dark forces from the inside and out that are going to pull your mind toward the negative. And if you don't intervene in that process, you're just, I mean, very practically, you're just not going to be as happy. You're just not going to be as happy of a
Yeah, I
person.
think humans tend to take things to extreme, so then
Yeah.
it becomes, well, oh God, I feel like I'm adverse to this positivity out there because you're trying to, but whatever, we take things to extremes. I think that the important thing is to be open, to be curious, as you're encouraging on this show. Like, we know from our research that people who struggle with depression, they are they tend to, it's not just like, oh, they have more negative thoughts. They
Yeah.
tend to set the bar really high. A lot of
Mm,
them are like perfectionistic, or
mm.
their expectations, and this goes back to Buddhism, that one of the sources of human suffering is rigidity. It must be like this. And if it
Yeah.
isn't, I'm going to be disappointed. I'm going to be angry. So again, back to the style in which we practice this. If somebody is, if their imagery is stressing them out, then we can have a beautiful conversation about expectation because likely they've set the bar really high for themselves, which tends to happen if you're depressed or you're struggling with it. And we can have a conversation around that. We can tweak imagery. It's not like you get what you get. That's it. Sorry. We can play with it. We can be playful. We can be mindful. Um, and everyone's different. I'm going to imagine, as you said, differently than you. And I'm going to have
Yeah.
maybe a stronger sense of smell than you're going to have. So understanding how we're different and training it and whatever our goal is. And honestly, like, we shouldn't allow anybody to make our lives toxic,
No.
whether they're positive or negative. We shouldn't, allow that to bring toxicity into
Yeah.
our lives.
Yeah. Including ourselves. And I think oftentimes we are often the engine of our own negativity or our own disappointment. And it's more complicated than that because like
Yeah.
we're this permeable bubble of consciousness that's influenced by what's going in and trauma and what happened when we were kids and but we also have so much power in orienting ourselves toward the future and that's like there's such a lack of that there's such a lack of knowledge on how to positively orient yourself toward the future. And I'm sure you dealt with this all the time as a therapist. Like most of the modalities are like, let's look back at all the things that fucked you up as a kid. It's like that's not really a good way to build a relationship with the future. So there,
No,
I'm sure there's a balance, but
yeah, there's a balance. I am still a big believer in therapy, but there is a growing body of evidence that the more we revisit a trauma, the more hold it has on us. Unless, like, there's revisiting it in a supportive environment, in a way that you can express it. But if you're constantly going back there,
yeah,
you're conditioning the body to believe that it can go back there. So yeah, there's a lot. I think that there's a lot of change we'll see in the world of psychology in the next decade. But I think fit is just the beginning. I mean, I think from what I've seen from where I'm sitting, it's really amazing. Like, one of the stories I love is a young person I worked with who he was an overthinker. Wow. He was Olympic level overthinker. And but he took to imagery because he had a background as a student athlete. He was a rower, which is my sport as well. And so I taught him, we trained his imagery, we measured it, we trained it, and he started to use it. He had this decision to make between two summer internships, between sophomore and junior year. And one everyone was pushing him toward. It was working for like a rock star financial guy who handled some of the biggest money on the globe. And then the other was working for this pretty rock solid but accounting firm. And everyone was pushing him in this one direction. And when he used his imagery to see himself in both work environments, which he had visited, he knew that first one was a Shark Tank and he didn't do well in Shark Tanks. He was a real team player. So he opted for the accounting firm, right? And when he put himself in the future using his imagery of his first day, what it would be like, he called me and he was like, I have to talk to you like right away. I thought something terrible had happened. But he said, do you remember the imagery of, like, the light in my office and how the door opened? I didn't remember the specifics of it, but I'm like,
yeah.
I remember the description. And I remember you said you got a high five on the first day. And he's like, that happened. It all happened. I found an error and the CEO found me and gave me a high five. And he's like, I don't know how you did it. And I said, I didn't do it. I don't even know how we did it, but you did it. Like, you had this vision and somehow that's exactly how it played out. And I see that, as I mentioned earlier, like, there are things that we can measure. I couldn't measure why that happened.
Right.
I can tell you that it's not the only client who's come back and said things happened precisely as they saw them. And the book, which from like Fran Drescher, said that that's how her career started,
Wow.
nanny, to like the Martinas of the world. Like, it starts with the images that you hold in your head. With Fran, they told her a Jewish woman would never be a lead on TV. They'd never have corporate sponsors, commercials.
Wow.
And she just said, I'm not doing it unless I can play a Jewish woman. And you just watch. We'll get those sponsors. And then she has like one of the longest sitcoms on TV.
Yeah.
So, like, really not allowing your mind to be corrupted by social contagion, but really holding, for her, that was important. That was like not negotiable.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that allowing yourself to follow your intuition and then stumbling across a synchronicity like that is one of the weirdest things, most magical things about life. And when they happen to you, it's just like there's this sense of like, how and why is this happening? And this shouldn't be possible, but it's happening. And when it does happen, it, again, it just like evokes this wonder where I don't like, I used to want to reach for an answer and be like, oh, this means this, and it means I'm on the right. Yeah.
We can't really show up and pay attention if we haven't cleared the space for it.
Yes. Yes. Well, this has been a hugely fascinating, in particular, how to use it. So I'm looking forward to the book, to pick it up wherever you procure your reading material